Now, what we're addressing here is that it's becoming very apparent that more children are playing video games, and they're playing them for an increased duration of hours per week. So if you look at a recent study in the United States, boys were playing 16 hours a week, and girls were playing for 9 hours a week on average, and the maximum was about 36 hours per week. Some children were playing, like being a full-time job. In Singapore, a 2-year study following children and tracking them, they didn't divide them into boys and girls, but the average playtime then had increased to 20 to 22 hours per week. This is a massive dose of gaming for children. And it's raised concern, the literature is full of concern of the potential harmful effects of playing video games. But the adult literature is full of useful effects of playing particularly action video games, where you get improved executive functions such as visual-spatial skills, visual short-term memory, increased attention, more flexibility for moving between tasks. And these are all very helpful functions that normal children find useful, and also children with disability may have impairment in these areas. So we were looking to investigate whether action video games may be a useful therapeutic tool, particularly in children with cerebral palsy or learning difficulties. So this study asks, and this study is only looking at normal children recruited in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, so not a radical society at all, a very conservative society. And we asked, do children who play action video games have enhanced executive functions? Can we look at a causal relationship by looking for a dose-response effect? And we're now actually doing an intervention study to actually nail a causation relationship. Or does this simply reflect gender differences, that boys play more action video games for longer and they're better at those skills than girls? So we recruited 155 children aged 6 to 12 years, and these children were really pretty much selected at random. We didn't ask who plays games, we just asked for children randomly selected from the classes. And we obtained 154 children, and the first notable statistic is only one child wasn't playing video games regularly out of those 154 randomly selected children. If you then look at the subject characteristics, we had in this population 66 boys and 88 girls. I think that distribution reflects societal difficulties for a woman to study boys in Saudi, but they were still randomly selected in both groups. The IQ difference, there was no IQ difference between those children who played action video games only, played action video games, and those who played strategy and social games only. So an action video game, we defined them according to those definitions there. Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto, that type of game. Whereas the social game was The Sims and a range of strategy games as well. So there was no IQ difference between those who played action video games and those who did not play action video games. And there was no difference in the age either. So that the population, in terms of those important factors for executive functions, were matched. If you then look at the distribution of hours played per week for action video games versus social and strategy and versus a mixed genre, you can see that on average, children were playing 16 hours per week of games, that boys played action video games for longer than girls, and girls played social and strategy games longer than boys. So there is a gender difference in the dose effect of the games. And you could see that these differences between boys and girls were statistically significant for both action and social and strategy games, but not for the mixed genre games. If you look at the maximum hours played per week, they were very similar to those reported in America, with some children playing a full working week of video games, in addition to attending school. We looked to see if this difference between boys and girls and the amount of hours they played action and non-action video games held true across all age groups. So here we're looking at the age of the children on the x-axis and the hours, the duration of gameplay per week on the y-axis, and you can see that across all age groups, boys played action video games longer than girls. Girls played social video games longer than boys, but in total across all age groups, boys played more hours of video games than girls. So gender is a very important factor you need to control for in these studies. We performed tests of executive function on the children, and we used a computerized automated test called the Cantab, because it's agnostic to language and it's agnostic to culture. So that's been shown. So it was not important that these children spoke Arabic and that it had been validated on a European population. And among the tests that we studied, you could see that spatial working memory, attention, response inhibition, and motor function were significantly different between action video game players and non-action video games players overall. So the all is boys and girls together, with the action video game players having superior scores in all those areas to the non-action video game players. We then looked at only girls, because we had roughly equal numbers of action video game players and non-action video games players, and we could compare without a gender effect to see whether this effect on executive functions was maintained within a single gender. And we could see that again this was true, that within girls only, spatial working memory, attention, response inhibition, and motor function was superior in those people who played, or those girls who played action video games. And we wanted to look then to see if this held true across the age range. So again, on the x-axis we have the age of the subjects, and on the y-axis we have the score on the test. And you can see that the difference between the groups, with the non-action video game players in red and the action video games players in blue, that there was a difference across all the age groups in these test scores. And for each test score, the action video games players had the superior score. So for example, in span length, a longer length is superior, but when you're looking at timing, a shorter timing is superior. So across all the age groups, you could see this effect. The other effect I'd like you to see is that executive function is maturing very rapidly over this age group. So when you're looking at comparing groups, you need also to control for age, because there's a rapid maturation over that age group, over that age range. So here, we were looking at seeing if there was a relationship between the number of hours playing action video games and your score on the executive functions. And so if we take, for example, here, and it's got 3 dimensions, on this axis is the number of hours played. On this axis is the variable score, and because age was so important, we did 3 dimensions so you could take into account in this graph for age. And I'll just pick 2 examples. This test here is a test for attention. And you can see here the shorter score is a better score. Lost my arrow now. And so those with the short score tended to have a higher number of hours of playing video games than those with a long score, which tended to have a low number of hours of playing video games. If we look at something like span length, we would expect to see the other relationship. Those with a low span length could remember very few numbers in the span length, also had low number of hours of playing action video games independent of age, and those that had a high here tended to have a high score. And so here is the data obtained from a univariate analysis taking into account age. And you can see that there was a relationship, significant relationship, between the number of hours that an individual played action video games and their score on these tests of executive function. And in all these tests, the longer you played the video game, the more superior your score was. So in conclusion, these findings support playing action video games at least accelerates the maturation of executive functions in children. We would need to look at these data again in adults, but the data in adults suggests that it may actually lead to a higher plateau level. And therefore, video games may have a therapeutic value in looking at children who may have difficulty in the maturation of their executive function. I think this at least counterbalances societal concerns that playing action-based games may lead to increased aggressiveness and or poorer academic performance. But I was amazed to find that 6-year-olds in Saudi Arabia were playing Call of Duty where Americans shot Arabs. And I found that quite chilling when we looked at the distribution of the games that people were playing. And so I'm not saying that shouldn't be societal concern, but I'm saying that we can counterbalance it by this. So at present, we're now looking at children with cerebral palsy to look at what games they play and see if we see abnormalities in executive function or similar patterns. And Maha is also doing an intervention study where we're taking subjects who do not play action video games, we're randomizing them to continuing with social or with action video games, and it's a double-blinded study to look to see if we can actually shift the maturation of subjects who are not playing action video games in line with what you would expect from our dose-response relationship. So we hope maybe next year we can present the results of that study. Thank you very much.